What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host Josh Spiegel and this is The 80s Project, 1981. We've kicked off 1981 and this already is starting to feel more 80s. And what I'm most thankful for is that clearly slasher movies are becoming more plentiful and cannibal movies are becoming way more scarce. And this block has some great stuff lined up, just some all-time classics, but also one of the worst movies that I've ever seen. This block begins on February 20th with the television premiere of The Intruder Within, which you can tell from the poster itself is trying to cash in on Alien, but instead of outer space, takes place on an ocean oil rig. When they start to dig deeper than they ever have before, they encounter a snake-like creature that again is going to seem very familiar considering it's an almost exact duplicate of the baby xenomorph that pops out of Kane. But then there's also these weird rock things that they discover as well, and when one of the crew members gets a scratch from one of them, he starts to go mad, while at the same time a weird substance oozes out of them. Throw in a guy who's more interested in the alien objects than the lives of the crew members, and you've basically got a movie saying, yeah, I know we're just alien, but look, it's the ocean and we're on Earth, so it's completely different, right? And here's something weird. The company man figures out that the egg things are a throwback and that a long time ago these creatures wiped out a bunch of our ancestors before sinking to the bottom of the sea, where they've been waiting until now. And for some reason, he has this evolutionary chart to illustrate his point. So did he just have this like laying around, I guess, like just in case? For the most part, the alien influence is pretty minimal, mainly due to budget restrictions, instead sticking with people infected by the organisms. But in the final 10 minutes, one of the crew with the contagion, or whatever you want to call it, has a form of chest burster, I guess. Whatever you want to call this. And then we get a full-on alien ripoff with the Intruder of the title, with this thing that very clearly was inspired by our favorite xenomorph. Occasionally, it's noted that Giger designed this creature, and looking at it, it's easy to see why people thought that, but he wasn't attached to this at all, and it's merely a case of some appropriated influence. Although one thing that they didn't copy is the really weird sound effects that this thing makes. My rating on this one is a 2.5. It has some moments at all, but for the most part, it's just a bit dull. Its horror significance is similar at a 2 because it is a bit known, but mainly for not being original. And even though the title carries some recognition, most of what people know it for is being a ripoff film. Should you watch it? Yeah, possibly. It's fine. Next, on February 24th, in Italy, Murder Syndrome was released, although its original title was Murder Obsession. It starts on a movie set as Michael here gets a little carried away on set, and he and his girlfriend go to visit his mother at a remote estate. And things are really awkward from the get-go, and it appears as if there's some sort of dark secret looming. His father was a musician they referred to as the Maestro, and it appears as if Michael killed him, and when he invites the cast and crew of the movie he's on, it includes Laura Gemser, who we saw last year in Erotic Nights of the Living Dead, but is most well known for playing Emmanuelle in a number of films from that series. Things get wild and surreal when it appears as if someone is in the house trying to kill them, but there's also dreams with zombie guys, spiders, and bats, and for a while it looks like it's becoming another movie entirely, and seriously, look at this spider attack, which is clearly just a guy with fuzzy gloves, but it's all just a dream sequence. This one was the work of director Ricardo Freda, who was a very experienced director at this point and had been making films since the 40s. He made his name doing the classic sword and sandal flicks, as well as some crazy horror like Lust of the Vampire and the horrible Dr. Hitchcock. This would actually end up being his final directorial effort, and it seemed that he retired until his death in 1999. This shoot was very troubled, with several of the actresses complaining about their treatment and unsafe shooting conditions, including a real knife and an actual chainsaw, and Freda himself would go on to dismiss the film as well. A good portion of it does play out like a standard giallo, but it tends to wander all over the place, giving perhaps too many twists, and when released, did okay at the box office, but didn't really stand out in an already crowded genre. My rating on it is a 2.5. It's fine, I guess. It's not terrible, and with the weird surreal stuff, it's not really boring, but it's just not saying anything new or in a very interesting way. Its HCS is low at a 1.5 because it's mostly unknown, features no real horror stars, and didn't impact the genre. Should you watch it? Possibly. It's not terrible, but you're not missing a lot either.
You're a murderer! You killed him! I loved him, and now you've killed him! Damn you!
February 27th brought us some fun with Road Games from Down Under, which has Sergeant Zdenko as a trucker and a man strangling a woman with a guitar string. When Quid heads out the next morning, he encounters various people on the road before getting suckered by one of them into giving her a ride, and she tells him that there's a maniac on the roads killing women. He starts to suspect this van that he keeps on seeing and spots the driver burying something in the desert, and this one was the work of Richard Franklin and is his follow-up to the very successful Patrick. Right after this, he'd gained more success by making a very solid sequel to one of the greatest horror films of all time, Psycho 2, and then the oddball action flick, Cloak and Dagger. But this was his sort of tribute to Rear Window in a way, just set out on the open road through a truck window instead of an apartment, and had a budget of $1.75 million, the highest ever for an Australian film at the time. Laurie Strode herself shows up, but this won't be the last time we see her this year, and between this and The Fog, she seemed to be typecast as a hitchhiker getting picked up by our older leading man. She also said that she was treated with a bunch of scorn from the Aussie crew for being an American and accused of trying to put Australians out of work. And interestingly, given that he'd go on to make a sequel to a Hitchcock film, and this is sort of based on a different Hitchcock film, Jamie Lee's character is nicknamed Hitch as a nod to the famous director. The two decide to team up to hunt the killer, but maybe too late, as it seems he's also hunting them. Unfortunately, it was a huge disaster upon release, doing very poorly on Australia, but then also failing in its US release, which Franklin blames on the marketing since they made it look like a pretty basic slasher flick based on the poster art. My rating on this one is a 3.5. I enjoy it, and I think it's doing some good stuff, and it makes for a nice watch, but it's definitely missing something that would take it any higher. Its HCS is a 3, since it's clearly a known film and well remembered, but never really made a hit status, and is also boosted by Curtis's involvement and Keach's lead performance. Should you watch it? Yes, it's recommended. Here's another one from the small screen because on February 27th, Midnight Offerings aired on ABC. It starts with pentagrams, black cats, Enchanting, so it looks like we're about witches right now, and this one uses her powers to kill a man. It has Mary Ingalls and her hunky ex David, and they announce that their teacher was the guy that was blown up. And it seems as if there's been a series of accidents on campus. And the TV faces keep coming as Aaron Walton is a new student there, and the head cheerleader is a very young Vanna White, her very first acting role. Seems that Vivian is our killer witch, and she's not above using her powers for personal gain, like breaking someone's leg to get Robin a place on the cheer squad. But when Robin and Dave hit it off, you know the trouble's coming. Vivian's dad is the guy who tried to molest Arnold, but it turns out that Robin also has powers of her own, so it turns into a battle over Dave's affections. Rod Holcomb is the director here, and holy crap, this guy didn't really do movies, but he has done so freaking much TV and TV movies, it's astounding. This one was somewhat early in his career, but he had previously done the Captain America TV movie, and then just began a long stretch of various shows stretching through the decades. This dude did episodes of The Greatest American Hero, The Equalizer, Lost, and The Mentalist, just to give you an idea of how far his career has spanned. If you're expecting any sort of high horror on this one, you're not going to get it. It's very low on effects.
Why don't you go to the police?
And tell them what? They put me in some basket weaving class.
That doesn't sound that bad, actually. I'm probably down to learn how to make some baskets. My rating here is a 2 because it's just a pretty standard movie of the week kind of thing, like a little dull, not too interesting. Its significance is just a 1.5 because it's mostly TV folk not known for horror, even though some of them we'll see a bit later in some more influential things. Should you watch it? You could probably skip.
Not that I see anything wrong with what my father would call a little slap and tickle, but
Heading into March now and back on the big screen, on the 4th in Italy, Madhouse was released. This has a school for the deaf with Julia here as a school teacher, and she has an identical twin named Mary who has some sort of skin disease, and they had a bit of a tangled history. It seems Mary used to torture Julia, and then there's some sort of mysterious Rottweiler out there killing people. And this was actually originally released under the title There Was a Little Girl, but was released here as Madhouse, but also And When She Was Bad, Flesh and the Beast, and Scared to Death. Julia is told that her sister has escaped the hospital and she starts a stabbing, and their uncle is a priest, and this one makes that rare, bold choice of killing off the little kid character. The director here is Ovidio Assayas, who also directed the Exorcist clone Beyond the Door and the Jaws clone Tentacles, and is reportedly the actual director of Piranha 2, but we'll talk about that when we get to 1982. There's reports of Assayas firing the director of this film shortly after production began, but there doesn't seem to be any information about that out there, and it's possible that that story got confused with the firing of James Cameron off of Piranha. But this was also placed on the video nasty list, and because of this, wasn't released in the UK in the theaters. It did manage to get an uncut release on video, but even then was pulled from the shelves. The plot doesn't make a ton of sense and throws some curveball twists at you in the final act, but compared to his other works, this one is at least a fairly original concept and has a handful of wild death scenes, and a pretty insane dog hand puppet at the end that I think is supposed to be a big shocking scene, but ends up being pretty hilarious since it's so unconvincing. I'm giving this one a 2.5 because there's some fun scenes and wild scenarios, but they never really add up. It's fun to watch, but there's just not enough of it. Its HCS is a 2 since it's a bit more remembered but still pretty obscure, but its classification as one of the nasties gives it a little more oomph. Should you watch it? Probably for the crazy gore stuff, but not so much for the plot.
Hi, diddle diddle, the cat in the fiddle.
Our next entry is from March 6th, and it's a big one, and it's Maniac. This one could have been in the 1980 episodes since it did have a premiere at a film festival in May of 80, and it did play a small run in New York in January of 81, but March 6th is when it went wider. It starts with introducing us to Frank Zito, played by Joe Spinell, who had previously appeared in the first 2 Rocky movies and Taxi Driver, but here plays a tortured man who has a Jason-like shrine to his mother going, and he also has a habit of picking up prostitutes and killing them, scalping them afterwards, and then stapling it to a mannequin that he has in his apartment. This was the mainstream directorial debut for William Lustig, who had previously done a couple of X-rated films, and is also the nephew of legendary boxer Jake LaMotta, the guy who Raging Bull is based on. After this, he'd go on to do a handful of other horror movies like the Maniac Cop series and Uncle Sam, and then just moved into producing. The special effects of the film were done by up-and-coming Tom Savini, who also appears in the film in one of the most notorious segments, in which his own head gets blown apart by a shotgun blast. It was a scene that would soon become the film's calling card, as it caused Gene Siskel to walk out of the theater, refusing to watch the rest in order to review it. It was made on a very low budget, mostly funded by profits from the adult films that Lustig had made, and a good deal of it was shot without the necessary permits, forcing them to shoot guerrilla style, which made for some interesting issues, like this scene in which the nurse is supposed to be completely alone in a subway station, even though there's clearly several people right here. The release had no rating, since they knew that if they submitted it, that it would receive an X due to the amount of violence, so they didn't even bother. And at the time, it was easier to get your film into a theater with no rating at all than if it had an X rating. And it seemed to be the right move, since it was quite successful upon release, making around $10 million at the box office, and went on to become known as one of the most notorious slasher flicks of all time. A sequel was almost made, with Joe Spinell really trying to get it off the ground. He and combat shock director Buddy Giovinazzo shot a short 10-minute proof of concept reel for it in 1986, and it seemed to drum up some interest, but it never came to be, and Spinell passed away 3 years later in '89. In 2012, a remake was released, directed by Frank Calhoun, who took a more avant-garde approach to it, which starred Elijah Wood as Frank Zito, which was critically acclaimed but failed to generate the fire that the original did with ticket sales. And you know what else the remake didn't have? Caroline Munro. My rating on it is pretty solid. It's a 3.5 for me. I do think its reputation is a little stronger than the actual film, but it is a weird, dirty character study. Its HCS is higher though, at a 4 for being a star showcase for Savini, kicking off Lustig's horror career, and sort of being a weird kind of urban parallel to Texas Chainsaw. Should you watch it? Yeah, enjoy that grimy delirium. Okay, next up is one with no set release date, but we know it played in 1981, and it's Night of Horror. And I previously featured this on a list of the worst horror films of all time. And if you're wondering why it was on there, well, here's how it starts.
I heard from Darlene that you were back in the valley. Well, I knew you were staying in San Antonio for a while.
It's two people talking in what's supposed to be a bar, but is clearly someone's basement, but their backs are to the camera, the lighting's off, and the audio is garbled.
Well, very few people have seen you in the last few weeks. Say you were bombed out of your mind about all the time.
It's a rock band, and one of their members wants to quit because of something that happened when he went back home for his father's funeral. He and his brother and his brother's wife and a friend of hers went on a camper vacation. It took 10 minutes to get to this point. 10 minutes of two guys' backs explaining that he's in a band and had a weird experience. And I'm telling you that I've already watched this, and the biggest complaint about it is just how absolutely horrible and dull that it is. And just watching it again, it's giving me some pretty hardcore flashbacks. And I'm not sure if you've seen me say this in my videos before, but I'll say it again. One of my least favorite things in movies is when there's a narrator talking over the action, but what they're saying is totally unnecessary. And that's 90% of what's going on here. Just a narrator telling us what we're looking at.
Just started to put up a fight to drive. Coming on kind of strong. I just smiled and nodded. I was going to be very happy staying in the back.
There's also background music that's playing over the driving footage, and prepare yourself because there's so much driving footage, and the music is basically 4 bars of piano melody played over and over and over and over again. And that's not it. Everything is drawn out. For instance, you'll get to hear Colleen here recite the entirety of a Poe poem.
Would you like to hear it? The ring is on my hand, and the wreath is on my brow. Satins and jewels grand are all at my command.
And again, it's 22 minutes into this movie, and I'm not joking. All that's happened is that you found out that Steve had a weird thing happen on a trip And you have seen him and his brother start on their trip. That's it. That's all that's happened. And this was from Tony Malinowski, who only directed 3 movies, including this one. And another one was sort of a remake of this one, but he's done a lot of work as an editor for a variety of low-budget films. But this one was really low, like around $4,000, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was lower than that by like dropping one of the zeros. And I'm gonna break it to you softly. All that happens in this movie, which is just a little over an hour, is they drive, stop, encounter some ghosts from the Civil War who ask them to sanctify the remains, and they do. The end! There's no horror in this night. The zombie on the cover is not present. Instead, you get a bunch of footage that someone just went and shot at their local Civil War reenactment. My rating here is a 1. This is without a doubt one of the worst movies that I have ever seen, and I'm not even sure that I can respect its effort on the low budget. Its significance is also a 1 since it's barely remembered and launched no careers, and the only time it's ever brought up is if someone is talking about the worst movies they've ever seen on some YouTube channel where the host forces himself to watch these things as if there's someone dumb enough to do that. Should you watch it? No, you shouldn't. I did. Twice now. Don't be me.
I mean, the whole thing just blew my mind away so bad.
Then, on March 13th, we get another kinda big entry with The Funhouse, which begins in what appears to be my ex-girlfriend's room. And then, it's a psycho gag with possibly the creepiest little brother of all time. Like he's worse than the bodacious boobies kid from Night of the Demons. So Amy here is picked up on a first date with Buzz, and they pick up a couple of friends to go to a carnival that has a spooky reputation. Little Joey sneaks out to go too, and look at this big bubs of a cow. There's a collection of oddball characters working there, including Kevin Conway, who plays multiple roles here, and we saw him recently in the sci-fi film The Lathe of Heaven. The Phantom of the Paradise is here too, as a Dracula magician, and they piss off the fortune teller, but there's also a big old spooky Frankenstein there. Our group decides to make that classic horror movie decision to sneak back into the carnival after it closes and spend the night in the funhouse, with little Joey tagging along. The teens witness the Frank murdering Xena and the eventual reveal of what's behind the mask, and this was Tobe Hooper in the chair and his first work of the 1980s, and oddly enough, apparently Steven Spielberg asked him to direct this script for a little film he had called E.T., but Hooper had to pass because he was busy doing this one. I can't really imagine a world in which we instead got Tobe Hooper's E.T. Instead of Reese's Pieces, I feel like they would have lured him in with barbecue beef or something. Probably because of Toby's involvement, there was the thought that this was another gore-filled slasher flick instead of the sort of classic monster movie vibe that it actually had, and it's possible that that caused some confusion. In the UK, they tried to designate it as a video nasty, but the prosecution was unsuccessful because there's very little gore in the film. There's become an assumption that they were confusing it with the 1977's The Last House on Dead End Street, which had an alternate title of The Fun House with a space in between the words. The makeup for the villain, Gunther, was designed by legendary Rick Baker, and the budget on this one was around $3 million, and when it was released, the reviews were pretty mixed. Its more subtle approach gained some appreciation from the critics, but it ultimately fell a little flat at the box office, only bringing in around $8 million, which made it profitable, but not by very much. For me, this one is a 3.5. It's pretty enjoyable and all, and has a lot going for it, but for Hooper, it just kind of feels a bit too traditional, not very special. Its HCS is the same since it's from a horror legend and is pretty well known, but doesn't get much higher because it's one of Hooper's lower profile entries and just never seemed to nail down that longevity that some of his others did. Should you watch it? Yes, you should. Some really good stuff happening here. Next up is one that's a bit contentious, but possibly on March 15th we have Frightmare, which was also called The Horror Star, which has a Vincent Price-like character pushing a belligerent director off a balcony. Conrad is having health issues and fakes his death to kill off an old rival right before dying for real. And then after his funeral, a group of drama students break into the cemetery. Their group includes Professor Herbert West in his very first horror role, as well as Police Academy's Scott Thompson. One other group is also Luca Bercovici, who definitely acted in quite a few things after this, but also switched to more behind-the-scenes things like producing and directing. He went on to make the first Ghoulies film a few years later, in which he also cast Thompson, probably because of working together here. And they actually steal Conrad's corpse and take it home with them. And here's the deal with this one. No one seems to be able to agree when it was released. It was shot in 1981, and several places list that as the year of release. Vinegar Syndrome, who released the film's home re-release, list that as the official date. However, books detailing classic horror sometimes list the release as 1982, and others at 1983. IMDb has the official release as September of 1983, and that seems to be when it got some sort of wider theatrical berth, but the factual date seems to be a bit lost to time. Porky shows up to investigate the missing body, and a psychic's tampering seems to revive the actor's corpse, which of course starts to stalk and kill the partying teens. And he does so with mind powers, I guess, using some black magic, and this was both written and directed by Norman Thaddeus Vane, who just never really established himself as a horror director or anything director, and only made a handful of other films. Oddly, when they show what is supposed to be classic clips of Conrad in action, they use footage of Christopher Lee instead, and this one kinda gets glossed over and never really made that big of a hit. It was made with a fairly low budget, reportedly around $100,000, but no box office info exists, which makes sense because people can't even figure out when it came out, let alone how much money it made. My rating on it is 2.5 stars. It starts out great. The first half hour is awesome, and then it just completely dies afterwards. Its significance is a 2, mainly for the start of Coombs' horror career and Berkovici's involvement, but it's just not well remembered. Should you watch it? I guess maybe for the opening of the film, but just be aware that it gets really dull, really quick.
But other pleasures await you. Come to me, my love.
Our final film on this block came out on March 20th, and it's this round's only sequel, and it's The Final Conflict, otherwise known as The Omen 3, The Final Conflict. It picks up after the second film with the 7 daggers being found and recovered, the only items capable of killing Damien, the Antichrist. We find out that Damien Thorne is now 33 years old and the CEO of a big company, and he's now Dr. Alan Grant.
Alan.
And oh my god, the timeline of this movie is maddening, considering the second movie was only 3 years earlier, and the character was 13 years old. So this is 20 years afterwards, but it's clearly taking place in real time. When an ambassador commits suicide through evil persuasion via dog, the president asks Damien to take his place, and there's signs that the second coming of Christ is about to happen. So, Father Spoleto, who knows Damien's true identity, assigns a group of assassins to try to take him down before he can find the returned Nazarene and kill it as a baby. And real quick, a president can't just be like, oh, this ambassador died, so I'm giving you the job. They have to be confirmed by the Senate, but I suppose not in this universe. And director Graham Baker took over the duties for this entry, although Richard Donner, who handled the first film, was considering returning to close out the series here, but eventually had to pass due to his issues after being fired from Superman 2. This was actually Baker's first feature film, although he has done some television before this, and he never really stuck as a major force in the industry, although he did the memorable sci-fi flick Alien Nation. And do you remember how I said that Madhouse made the rare move of killing a little kid character? Well, this one ups that ante by offing a whole bunch of babies, like a bunch of them. It was intended to be the final entry of the series and was marketed as such, but of course, it wasn't. It never is, because a decade later there was a part 4, although it was tenuously connected to the main series. A part 4 was expected much earlier than that though, because a 4th part was scheduled for 1984, but after a series of delays and unavailabilities, it was ultimately canceled. Costing around $5 million, this one was moderately successful, bringing in just over $20 million at the box office, although it was less successful than its 2 forerunners, and critics were far harsher with it. I'm kind of harsh on it as well, since I'm just going to give it a 3. It's not as interesting as you would hope, and I think the interesting part of Damien was his conflicted nature about being the Antichrist. Just having him be wholly evil makes the character kind of a bit blander, and the movie follows suit. Its significance is pretty solid though at a 3.5. It's sort of a final entry of the series with a young star who'd go on to much bigger things and is definitely remembered and noted. Should you watch it? Yeah, even though it's not as good as the 2 before it, it's still worth a watch. So there you have it, some bigger names in this block, but sadly none that I really love. Out of this batch, I think my favorite is the Funhouse. I'd say that Maniac is a close second, I guess. They're both really enjoyable flicks, but the Funhouse is a bit more, well, fun. Let me know what your favorite on this block is down below. I want to hear it. Which of these did you love? Which of these have you seen? Which of these do you now want to see? Tell me down below. If you liked the video, hit that like button. If you want to subscribe to the channel to keep getting notified when the 80s project videos are coming out, hit subscribe and click the bell so you get the notifications. And if you think about it, go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines like these guys, and you can help support this channel and keep it going, because it is going to keep going, because we still got a lot of the 80s left. A lot of the 80s left to cover here on the 80s project.